I don't go near the creek anymore. Not since the summer of 1997, when everything I knew about my quiet little world turned to ash. Even now, decades later, I can still hear the whispers that seem to rise with the morning mist, curling around my thoughts like 1,000 invisible fingers. Back then, I was just a kid, 11 years old, full of endless curiosity, and armed with a bicycle that I thought could take me anywhere. Willow Creek was a tiny town tucked into the folds of endless woods and hills, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest excitement was the annual county fair. My mom worked double shifts at the diner after my dad left, so most of my days were spent exploring the woods with my dog, Jasper. Jasper was a golden retriever, a scruffy and loyal shadow who followed me everywhere. Together, we'd roam through the trees, pretend we were adventurers, and race the sun back home. But that summer, something changed. The woods didn't feel like my woods anymore. They felt heavier, darker, as if the trees had grown secrets they weren't willing to share. It all started with the whispers. It was a Monday afternoon, sticky with humidity, and I had ventured farther into the woods than usual. Jasper barked at something ahead, his tail wagging cautiously. That's when I heard it, a faint, breathy sound, like someone whispering my name. Danny. At first I thought it was my imagination, but when I froze, holding my breath, the whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. My skin prickled, and Jasper's barking turned to a low growl. I scanned the trees, my heart hammering, but there was no one. Danny? The whisper seemed to drift on the wind, coming from everywhere and nowhere. And then I saw it. Deep in the shadows of the trees stood a figure, half hidden behind the mossy trunk of an old oak. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out its features, but its eyes, if they were eyes, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Jasper, too, stood frozen, his growl growing softer, almost as if he'd given up trying to warn me. Then it moved, a single step forward, slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, Jasper's barking snapping me out of my paralysis. I didn't stop until we were back in my backyard, my lungs burning and my ears ringing with the memory of that voice. I told my mom about the whispers that night, but she just smiled tiredly and chalked it up to an overactive imagination. "You've been watching too many scary movies, Danny," she said, ruffling my hair before heading to bed. But it wasn't my imagination. The whispers didn't stop. Every time I ventured near the woods, I'd hear my name, carried on the wind like a dark lullaby. And every time, I'd see the figure. It never came closer than the edge of the trees, but its presence was enough to make my skin crawl. I stopped going into the woods altogether, opting instead to stay close to home. Jasper didn't seem to mind. He'd sit by my side, his head resting on my knee, as if he could sense my unease. Then one night, the whispers came to me at home. It was around midnight when I woke up to the sound of Jasper whining. My room was pitch black, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon outside. At first, I thought he just needed to go out, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping on my window. Tap, tap, tap. My heart stopped. I lived on the second floor. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was nothing there, just the swaying branches of the tree outside. But then I saw it. A shadow moving across the glass, too large to belong to any tree. "Danny." The whisper came again, clearer this time, and my blood turned to ice. Jasper began to growl, low and guttural, his body tense. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the covers over my head, and prayed for morning. Things escalated quickly after that night. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and strange things began to happen around the house. Objects would go missing, only to turn up in impossible places. My mom's wedding ring, which she never took off, vanished one morning and was later found hanging from a branch in the backyard. Doors would creak open on their own, and at night I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway outside my room. My mom blamed it on stress. "Just your imagination, Danny." But I knew better. The figure was watching me, waiting. The final straw came one evening when Jasper disappeared. He'd been outside for only a few minutes when I heard him yelping, a sharp, terrified sound that cut off abruptly. I ran out into the yard, calling his name, but he was gone. The only trace of him was a trail of paw prints leading into the woods and a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Danny." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, clutching a flashlight, and stared into the darkness. That's when I saw the lights. Faint, flickering lights like candles glowing deep in the woods. They moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like a procession. And then I heard the chanting. Low and guttural, it rose and fell like a dark hymn, its words indecipherable but heavy with malice. My breath hitched as I saw figures moving between the trees, their shadows long and twisted in the flickering light. And at the center of it all was the figure. Taller than ever, its head crowned with antlers that seemed to scrape the sky. In its hands it held something small and lifeless, something that looked disturbingly like Jasper. The events of that night are a blur. I remember running into the woods, screaming Jasper's name, only to find myself surrounded by those figures. They moved in unison, their faces hidden behind masks made of bone and bark, their voices blending into a single, monstrous chant. The antlered figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, and everything went black. I woke up hours later at the edge of the woods, my clothes torn and my hands caked with dirt. Jasper was gone. When I stumbled back home, my mom was frantic, demanding to know where I'd been. But I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. The whispers had taken my voice. In the weeks that followed, I tried to tell myself it had all been a dream, but the whispers continued. Sometimes I'd hear them during the day, faint but unmistakable. Other times, I'd wake up to find strange symbols drawn in the dirt outside my window. My mom dismissed them as pranks, blaming the neighborhood kids, but I knew better. One night, I woke up to find my window open. The cool night air sent shivers down my spine as I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I hadn't opened the window, and neither had my mom. When I looked closer, I saw a single candle sitting on the windowsill, its wax dripping like blood. The whispers were louder that night, almost like a chorus, and the chanting returned, distant but clear. Years have passed since that summer, but the memories still haunt me. I moved away from Willow Creek as soon as I was old enough, but no matter how far I go, the whispers follow. I hear them in the dead of night, in the spaces between breaths, in the shadows that flicker at the edges of my vision. I've tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was just a child's overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. The figure, the chanting, the bone masks, they're still out there, waiting in the darkness. And sometimes when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I hear my name again, carried on the wind like a dark promise. They say the Alaskan wilderness is vast, unforgiving, and lonely. I learned the truth of those words when I was 17, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't the endless expanse of snow or the brutal cold that broke me. It was the shadows. Shadows that whispered secrets I wish I'd never heard. Back then, I lived in a tiny town called Haverhill, nestled in the shadow of the mountains and hugged by miles of frozen tundra. Haverhill had a population of maybe 300 people, tops. Most of the adults worked at the nearby oil rigs, while the kids, like me, tried to stave off boredom in a place where the sun barely graced the sky during winter. My mom worked long hours at the only grocery store in town, and my dad, well, he'd been gone since I was 6. I spent most of my time with my best friend, Caleb. We'd grown up together, thick as thieves, exploring the icy forests and frozen streams around the town. But that winter, Caleb wasn't himself. Something had changed in him. It started with whispers, things he claimed he heard when we went hiking past the old mines. "It's the wind," I told him the first time he mentioned it. "No," he said, his voice low and uncertain. "The wind doesn't call your name." We'd always been warned to stay away from the mines. They were abandoned decades ago after a collapse killed a dozen workers, and the locals swore they were cursed. But the warnings only fueled our curiosity. The first time Caleb dragged me there, I felt it, that inexplicable heaviness in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. The entrance to the main shaft was boarded up, but gaps in the rotting wood let through a cold wind that didn't feel natural. Caleb stood there, staring into the dark, his breath visible in the frigid air. "They're here," he whispered. I wanted to leave, but Caleb's fixation kept pulling us back. Over the next few weeks, he became obsessed. He started skipping school, disappearing for hours at a time. When I asked him where he went, he'd shrug and mutter something about the mines. One night, he showed up at my house, his face pale and his eyes wide with something like terror. "Come with me," he said. The walk to the mines felt longer than usual. The air was deathly still, the snow crunching beneath our boots, the only sound. Caleb didn't say a word the whole way. When we reached the clearing, I froze. The boarded-up entrance to the mine was torn open. Deep inside, faint flickers of light danced on the walls, like the glow of candles. And then there was the sound, low, guttural chanting, like a prayer spoken by 100 voices in unison. "Do you hear it?" Caleb whispered. I did, and I hated every second of it. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't," he replied, stepping closer to the gaping mouth of the mine. "They've shown me things. I have to go back." Before I could stop him, Caleb disappeared into the dark. I ran home that night, my breath catching in my throat as I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. The chanting followed me, faint but persistent, as though the mine itself had come alive and was calling me back. My mom noticed how shaken I was, but when I tried to explain, she just shook her head. "You're spending too much time out there in the cold," she said. "You've got an overactive imagination, just like your father." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. My father had been diagnosed with schizophrenia before he left us, and the thought of following in his footsteps terrified me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen and heard was real. The next day, Caleb didn't show up for school. He didn't answer his phone or respond to my texts. When I went to his house, his mom said he hadn't come home the night before. By the third day, the whole town was looking for him. The search party found nothing. No tracks, no clues. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, but I knew where he'd gone. A week later, I worked up the courage to return to the mine. The entrance was just as we'd left it, the boards shattered, the darkness yawning. I stepped inside, my flashlight barely piercing the thick blackness. The air was colder here, and the walls seemed to hum faintly, like they were alive. The deeper I went, the louder the hum became, and then the whisper started. "Eli." My name, spoken softly, almost lovingly, by voices that came from everywhere and nowhere. I turned off my flashlight, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing in the shadows, their faces obscured by bone masks carved with strange symbols. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved in silent synchronization. At the center of the gathering stood Caleb. He was different. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were black. Empty. He raised a hand, and the chanting grew louder, filling the air with a terrible vibration that made my teeth ache. "Join us," he said, his voice layered with something that wasn't human. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the mine or how I got home. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my bed, drenched in sweat. My mom was frantic, saying I'd been gone for 2 days. When I tried to tell her what happened, she shook her head. "You need help, Eli," she said. She wasn't wrong. After that night, the whispers followed me everywhere. I'd hear them in the dead of night, in the rustling of the trees, even in the silence of the classroom. My grades slipped, and I stopped talking to my friends. By the end of the year, I was in therapy, diagnosed with schizophrenia, just like my dad. The dreams came next. I'd see Caleb standing in the mine, surrounded by those masked figures. The chanting would fill my ears, growing louder and louder until I woke up gasping for air. I started drawing the symbols I'd seen on their masks over and over again, even though I didn't remember picking up a pencil. My therapist called it a coping mechanism. I called it a warning. One night I woke up to find frost creeping across my bedroom window. It was summer, and yet my breath hung in the air. I turned on the light and froze. The frost wasn't random. It had formed a pattern, one of the symbols I'd seen in the mine. And then I heard it. Eli. The voice was so close, it felt like it was inside my head. I spun around, expecting to see Caleb, but I was alone. The frost melted before I could show anyone, but I knew what it meant. They hadn't forgotten me. Years have passed since then. I moved far away from Haverhill, trying to leave the memories behind, but the whispers never stopped, and neither did the dreams. In them, I see Caleb standing in the mine, surrounded by the masked figures. They're waiting for something. For me. Sometimes I wake up to find strange symbols drawn on my walls, etched in frost that melts before I can show anyone. Other times, I hear faint chanting just outside my window, no matter where I live. I've tried to convince myself it's all in my head, but deep down I know the truth. They're still out there, and they're waiting. The Alaskan wilderness is vast, unforgiving, and lonely, but it's not empty. Something ancient lives beneath the snow and stone, something that whispers in the dark and calls us home. And one day, I'll have no choice but to answer. I never meant to go back to Blackwood Swamp. The memories alone were enough to twist my stomach into knots. The kind of fear that lingers in your bones long after the danger has passed. But some places don't let you leave, not really. Blackwood Swamp was one of them. I was 13 when it started, old enough to think I was invincible, but young enough to still be afraid of the dark. My hometown of Drayton, Maryland, sat on the edge of the swamp, a sprawling expanse of murky water, twisted cypress trees, and knee-deep fog. My friends and I called it the Murmur, named after the strange sounds that drifted through the air when the swamp came alive at dusk. Some said it was the wind, others said it was the croak of frogs or the distant hum of insects. But if you stood still and listened closely, the murmur almost sounded like voices, whispering, calling, begging. That summer, the swamp became our playground. My best friend Eric was the one who dared us to go deeper than we ever had before. Eric was fearless, the kind of kid who broke into abandoned houses and laughed at ghost stories. Then there was me, the cautious one, always looking over my shoulder, but never brave enough to back out. And finally, Rachel, Eric's cousin, who just moved to town and wanted to prove she wasn't a scared little girl. The first few trips were harmless. We'd wander through the shallows, tossing rocks into the water and daring each other to get closer to the heart of the swamp. But everything changed the night we found the circle. It was late, and the fog was thicker than usual, swirling around our ankles like it had a mind of its own. Eric led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "You hear that?" Rachel asked, stopping in her tracks. We listened. At first it was faint, barely louder than the rustle of leaves. But as we stood there, the sound grew clearer. It was a low, rhythmic chant, like 100 voices humming in unison. Probably just some old drunk singing in the woods, Eric said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We pressed on, the chanting growing louder with every step. And then we saw it. A clearing in the trees, bathed in an eerie yellow light. In the center was a circle of stones, each one carved with strange, twisting symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of the torches planted around them. Eric stepped closer, his flashlight beam dancing over the stones. "This is so cool," he whispered. But I couldn't move. The air was heavy, pressing down on my chest, and the chanting, it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling. "No way," Eric replied, crouching to get a better look at one of the symbols. "It's probably some old cult thing, like witches or whatever." That's when Rachel screamed. I turned to see her pointing at the edge of the clearing. At first I didn't understand what she was looking at. Then I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing just beyond the torchlight. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their eyes gleamed like polished stones, reflecting the flickering light in a way that made my stomach churn. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching us. "Run," I whispered, but my legs refused to obey. Eric finally turned around and froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The chanting grew louder, the voices rising in a discordant symphony that made my ears ache. And then, as if they'd all heard some unspoken command, the figures took a step forward. We ran. We didn't stop until we were out of the swamp and halfway back to town. None of us said a word. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the pounding of our feet on the dirt path. When we finally reached my house, Eric tried to laugh it off. "Just some weirdos playing dress-up," he said, though his voice cracked on the last word. But Rachel and I knew better. Those weren't just people. There was something wrong about the way they moved, the way their eyes glinted like they weren't human at all. That night, I dreamed of the circle. I saw the symbols carved into the stones, the torches casting long, flickering shadows, and those gleaming eyes staring back at me from the darkness. But in the dream, I was alone. Eric and Rachel were gone, and the figures were closer, their whispers filling my ears until I woke up gasping for air. The next morning, Eric didn't show up at school. Rachel said he'd texted her, saying he wasn't feeling well. By the third day, he stopped responding altogether. When we went to his house, his mom said he'd been staying in his room, refusing to eat or talk to anyone. "He'll snap out of it," she said, though the worry in her eyes told a different story. A week later, Eric was gone. His parents said he'd run away, but Rachel and I knew the truth. The swamp had taken him. After Eric disappeared, Rachel refused to talk about what happened. She stopped coming to school, and when I finally went to her house, her mom told me she'd been sent to live with her dad in another state. I tried to move on, to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But the whispers followed me. I heard them in the rustling of leaves, in the creak of floorboards, even in the silence of my room at night. The chanting came next, faint at first, then louder, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. By the time I turned 18, I'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The doctor said it was stress, a coping mechanism for the trauma I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew the truth. The swamp hadn't let me go. Not really. Years later, I moved away from Drayton, hoping to leave the memories behind. But the swamp found me, even here. I wake up to find strange symbols etched into the frost on my windows, symbols I haven't seen since that night in the clearing. Sometimes I hear footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate, like something is waiting for me to open it. The dreams are worse now. I see Eric standing in the circle, surrounded by the figures with gleaming eyes. His face is pale, his mouth moving silently as he chants along with them. And then Rachel appears, her hair matted with mud, her clothes torn as though she's been wandering the swamp for years. Her eyes are empty, reflecting nothing but the torchlight. They don't speak to me anymore. They just stare, their lips moving in silent synchrony. And yet I can feel their whispers crawling into my mind, pulling me back to that night. One time I woke to find my hands covered in dirt. My sheets were torn and streaked with mud and swamp water. I couldn't remember how it had happened, but the faint outline of a circle was drawn on my bedroom floor. In the center was a single word, join. Blackwood Swamp is still there, waiting in the fog. The locals say it's just a patch of woods, just a bunch of old stories. But I know better. Some places don't let you leave, and one day the whispers will call me back. I just hope I have the strength not to answer.